My talk tonight is called Memory Lane, or perhaps it could be called the synopsis of Lodge of Perfection talks from June 2010 through December 2015. Or it also could be called 5.5 years of tall tales from Tom. Any one of those would probably work. For the last 5+ years, I've attempted as orator to create a higher level of knowledge about our great fraternity, its history, its traditions, its buildings, and its leaders. Now, I didn't have possess all this great knowledge because, as a matter of fact, I learned right along with you, just maybe a few days ahead of it before I presented it. But it's been a great trip for me also. I've attempted to go back through all these talks, which have numbered 50, and pull out items which I think have had an important effect on our history. So here we go. Back to June of 2010, the first subject matter was Albert Pike, and that was certainly an appropriate first subject, as without Pike, we probably would not have a Masonic entity called Scottish Rite. Between the years of 1801 and 1860, the membership of the Southern jurisdiction was never more than 500. That's for 60 years, the first 60 years of the organization. It was never more than 500. And most of those members were located in Charleston, South Carolina, or in just the immediate surrounding states. After Pike's arrival, he gave the fraternity a true organized operation. He rewrote all of the degrees, and then he babysat this organization for the next 30 years. After he died, in true American fashion, the leaders thought bigger was better and equated success in numbers and with the help of the theatrical degree presentation, grew the Scottish Rite into the most influential arm of Masonry. Pike stressed intellectual knowledge, and later leaders stressed numbers and dollars. That's a little editorializing, I must say. During the following talks, we learned more about Pike than just from my humble efforts on that first night in June of 2010. The next talk analyzed our name, known as the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. A lot of Masons don't even know actually what those words mean. And so I went back and traced them, and of course the ancient and accepted were fairly normal because that was the operative and the speculative Masons. But then the Freemason, the FM standing for Freemasonry, and then the Scottish Rite, the SR part of it, they all are mysteries, partly mysteries, but I was planning to put that in tonight, but I'm going to leave it out just for time purposes. But if anybody has a question on those two subjects, well, see me afterwards. As I mentioned, a lot of people, particularly non-Masons, think that we have a Scottish heritage and that the home of the higher degrees were in Scotland, that they started in Scotland. Well, this is not true. And this is a hard question to answer, these two about free and about the Scottish part, to people who really don't know, because it takes a long time to get to it. And I've had that problem when I gave tours, and I'm sure Bill has too. People think that it's true because of the name. Anyway, we moved on to the description of the northern and southern jurisdictions. And again, many people, even some Masons, think that this has to do with the Civil War. And of course, it's not so, at least in the years prior to the war. The formalized version of the higher degrees was begun in Charleston, South Carolina in 1801. The degrees were taken then to New York and later in other surrounding states in an unauthorized form. Thereafter, there were some competing degrees up there in the northern area, each of which had its own Supreme Council. The Charleston or Southern jurisdiction just stayed clear of this mess. They didn't try to put lodges in the area or anything else. They just left it alone. Finally, in 1867, that's a long time, all the different factions in the North finally united and were formally recognized by the South and the rest of the Masonic world as the Northern jurisdiction. And they include the 15 most northeasterly states in the Union. And then finally, peace and harmony prevailed. Of course, that meant that the Southern jurisdiction has the rest of the 35 states and other locations that are outside of the states. The October, November, and December meetings in 2010 covered beginning Oklahoma Masonic history, which included the years of 1850 to 2010. Actually, the first Masonic Lodge was formed in Tahlequah in 1847, but did not receive their charter from the Grand Lodge of Arkansas until 1849. So that's the official date. That if somebody would ask the question, when did Masonry start in this area we now know as Oklahoma? Well, it started in Indian Territory part, and it was officially in 1849 with that first lodge. Soldiers stationed at, first of all, many Cherokees were Masons, the educated Cherokees were Masons in previous years before the removal, when they were still back in the southeastern part of the United States. And then United States soldiers stationed at Fort Gibson had also been Masons in previous years. So the two got together, and this was a way for the two different cultures to have common ground and become acquainted. Records indicate that there were more social activities and less ritual in that first lodge, but it actually was a uniting force back in those days. Other lodges, 6 actually, were formed in Indian Territory. However, the Civil War not only stopped Masonic activity, but most of the lodges were burned and records destroyed. After the war, lodges began to reappear, and in 1874, the three lodges met and formed the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory. A small village of about 100 people produced a lodge in 1877, which became Lodge number 9 in the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory. This was the small whistle stop on the Katy Railroad called McAlester. During these presentations, a lot of Oklahoma history was mixed in with the Masonic history. McAlester, which actually was Northtown in those days, became an important Masonic city as number 9 grew in size. And during the 1880s, the Yorkite Masonry came to McAlester and actually began in our city for the state of Oklahoma. So, well, actually for Indian Territory, I should say. The reason for McAlester Masonic interest was because of the efforts of a few McAlester men. Some of those prominent men, early McAlester Masons, were Edmund Doyle, J.J. McAlester, and Daniel M. Haley. There were a lot more, but these were the names that everybody recognizes. In 1895, another lodge was formed in South McAlester, which was designated in South McAlester, that's the only, it was designated number 81, which later became 96 after the joining of the two lodges. If there were 9 lodges in 1877 in Indian Territory and 81 in 1895, this shows how fast Blue Lodge Masonry was growing in Indian Territory. Next, we went into the detail on how the Grand Lodge of Indian Territory and the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma Territory merged into one, the Grand Lodge of the state of Oklahoma. This action took place in 1909, which was 2 years, actually it's 15 months, after statehood. During these 15 months, a lot of behind-the-scenes work was done to make this merger run smoothly on that February day in 1909. In March of 2011, we were in the process of restoration of our scenery drops. So the subject of how the Scottish Rite got in the business of true theatrical degree presentation was presented. This new wrinkle in changing from a lodge room setting to a stage with scenery, costumes, and so forth, caught on in the northern jurisdiction much quicker than in the southern jurisdiction, because Albert Pike was negative to this new approach. During the years of 1860 to 1890, the North gradually accepted the use of theater. And then after Pike died in 1891, this activity, the theater type presentation, exploded into the orients of the southern jurisdiction. This, of course, is the reason Scottish Rite temples require much larger buildings than other areas of masonry. That is, to accommodate the stage and auditorium, dressing rooms, costume rooms, and so forth. Now, you'll recall, some of you recall, that this meeting was held in Muskogee. We went up to Muskogee and presented and did our work up there, but we had, it was in the old temple up there. The rest of 2011 covered topics on such subjects as local Scottish Rite government and its history, which was a story about the change from the period of when the masters of the 4 lodges within a valley ran the operation up to 1966, when the advisory conference form of government was instituted, and included in that talk was the history of the C&E Foundation in the McAlester Valley. Regarding that particular part of it, during the first 52 years of the foundation, there was only 2 presidents during all that time. The first one was Stanley Hirsch of Oklahoma City, and then Dr. Robert Barthel of McAlester. Another subject which I personally have received more favorable feedback on than any of the others was the Albert Pike Hospital. It was how a dormitory building was built immediately south of the temple. Now, when we say temple, at that time, that was the old red brick building. So, and that took place in 1920. So that was done for the housing of our out-of-town members and candidates during reunions. And then it was, during the 20s, it was refurbished, added on to, and then turned into a hospital. The hospital was in operation from 1928 until 1950 for 22 years. I love the story that when they closed the hospital and the last patient was transferred out to General Hospital, they started looking for the keys to the front door. They found none. The door had not been locked for 22 years. The building was returned to dormitory status, but was rarely used. So in 1973, the building and many memories were demolished. The place where many Masonic stories were swapped, and the place where babies were born and people were nursed back to health, became a slab of concrete. The McAlester Scottish Rite did not want to get into the hospital business to start with, but the All Saints Episcopal Hospital was going out of business, and so this action was taken as a public service to the community. Thereafter, we embarked on a series of 6 programs on the history of the Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction at the national or Supreme Council level. This was the years of 1850 up until 1930. and we spotlighted the Grand Commanders from Pike to the beginning of the John Coles era. As a side note, Pike and Coles both served 31 years in the office of Grand Commander, and no one before or after has ever approached that time in office. Included in this 80-year period that we talked about were the years of 1910 to 1925, in which there was tremendous interest in fraternal organizations, all types, not just masonry. And when the Scottish Rite experienced bulging membership numbers, many huge temples were built. Also worth a full program through that series was the building of the House of the Temple in 1915, which is a tremendous architectural masterpiece, and most all Masons should try to make it a point to go up there sometime during their career, just to go through it. Of course, we've been celebrating the centennial of that headquarters building just this year. We learned that the Supreme Council gave carte blanche, or complete control, to Grand Commander James D. Richardson to both the drawing of the plans and the construction of this building. After receiving many concepts, Richardson selected the plan of 36-year-old architect named John Russell Pope. His design was based on the mausoleum of Halicarnassus by Roman builders. This ancient structure was located in what is now Turkey. Construction was begun in 1911 and completed in 1915. But Richardson died in 1914 and never got to see the finished product. Now, sandwiched in that 6-program series were presentations on Robert Burns, the Scottish poet and Mason, who wrote Auld Lang Syne. That was done in December, and then the next program, of course, was in February, and that was George Washington. Both of these, of course, were done for seasonal reasons. Auld Lang Syne, because we figured that a lot of Masons would be singing that song at New Year's Eve. And then February, of course, was Washington's birthday. The next 2 subjects were on the Great Depression. First, we just took the 1930s and looked into the terrible conditions caused by severe economic and weather conditions, primarily drought, and particularly the Dust Bowl area. Next, we looked into how the Depression affected the fraternity, both nationally and in the McAlester Valley. That was really tough, because those were years immediately after the building was constructed. We then had a series of 4 talks on the buildings of temples in McAlester and in Guthrie. As a matter of fact, it was two of each. 2 programs, and each valley had two buildings. Our first building in McAlester was a frame structure built in 1904, and it was called a tabernacle, loosely defined as a temporary temple. And then how a man named William Busby almost single-handedly built our first real temple, which is referred to now as the Red Brick Temple. That was done in 1906. 24 years later, our current temple was built on the eve of the Great Depression, and the grandiose financing plan went down the drain, and how the stalwart staff and officers of those Depression years actually saved this building. Guthrie's 2 temples created an interesting subject also. Harper Cunningham, our Orient's first SGIG, who was the honcho who not only created the Scottish Rite in what we now know as Oklahoma, but also was the man who got Guthrie's first temple built. The examples of Busby and Cunningham show that there's just no substitute for leadership. In December of 2012, I gave a talk on Will Rogers. And then the next presentation, which of course was in February, it was on Hitler. How about that for two different contrasts of two different type people? Since our current Sovereign Grand Commander, Ronald A. Seal, was coming to McAlester in 2013, he was our next subject. Later, a lot of the information was gained by a 30-minute telephone interview with Seal himself. I found him to be very courteous and quite informative. The next month covered all of the previous visits to McAlester by other Grand Commanders. Through the years of 2013 and 2014, we had a variety of programs, starting with McAlster's Light of Masonry, our big lighted ball on the top of our building. Following was the Mark Sexton and how the Rainbow for Girls organization was formed. And then we went to the Mysteries of Mount Moriah, another fine Masonic building in McAlester that had a really short tenure. Then we covered an affair which almost eliminated Masonry, all phases of Masonry in America, and that was the William Morgan affair, which took place in western New York State. You will remember that a group of Masons were convicted with minimal sentences of abducting William Morgan, a printer who was going to supply Masonic secrets to the public in 1826. Morgan disappeared. His body never found. This became big news nationwide. The American public was shocked, assuming that Masons had murdered this man and then had gotten off with minimal punishments because everybody, including the judges and jury, were all Masons. So this really Masonry took a hit. All phases of Masonry, Blue Lodge, York Rite, and the fledgling Scottish Rite, almost stopped and went underground. Even a national political party was formed, like the Republicans and Democrats. It was called the Anti-Masonic Party. Masonry, after 20 years, began to reappear in the 1840s. So from 1826 to somewhere in the 1840s, that's when Masonry almost just was wiped out. We then went back to the beginning of the American version of the higher degrees, which was the beginning of Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction in 1801. You know, we had already taken Pike from Pike's era on up to the 1930s, so we decided to go back and just start with 1801, the very beginning, with a talk entitled The 11 Men from Charleston. What was surprising to me in that presentation and particularly of the 11 men, was that Scottish Rite was begun with almost equal numbers of Christians, Jews, and Catholics in that original group. In February of this year, we began an 8-month series on the major leaders in Oklahoma Scottish Rite history. Basically, it was the SGIGs from Harper Cunningham through Joe Jennings, or from 1899 through 2009. We won't go into this series because it is fairly current. Now, I'm sure most people have remember it. And also, I'm running out of time. Two things popped out to me in these particular presentations, and that was 4 of the first 5 SGIGs were not only from the Valley of McAlester, but were from the city of McAlester. In my opinion, this was how and why McAlester was able to maintain a valley headquarters in a rural city 90 miles from a metropolitan area. It was because of dedicated leaders that we had there in those years of Masonry and McAlester. Oklahoma Scottish Rite leaders were not full-time Masons, as you all know. They were able to be successful in their jobs or professions and also very active in their communities, and then still provide leadership in Masonry. I'd say that was great time management for those folks. And so in conclusion, and I know when I say that in conclusion, some guy will kick the next guy and say, hey, wake up, this old boy's about to wind down. But anyway, if you'll just allow me a couple of comments. When I became orator, I don't know whether I felt it necessary to become the official educator of Masonic history, or whether I just got so involved in researching these subjects and thought that it would be interesting to everyone and that they would like to hear it. So I have a feeling it was more toward the second. My wife has said that for 2 weeks after a talk, I was a normal person. And then for the next 2 weeks, while researching and writing the next talk, I became a semi-recluse at home in the man cave, in the Masonic library, or in the public library. I know that I have made more of a job out of these presentations than what ritual calls for. And for that, I have to thank you for spending the extra 20 to 30 minutes after the meetings and being kind to an old man. I thank you.